King George continued to ignore that Declaration of Rights that the colonists had put together in the First Continental Congress. So, in May of 1775, once again, leaders were sent from all 13 colonies this time to meet in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. George Washington was officially made commander of the Continental Army, which they now created. So they combined all of the militias and were creating a Continental Army. George Washington was unanimously named the colonial commander of that army. They also began to prepare for more and more of a separation from Britain. They decided that the colonies were going to set up their own post office in order to be able to have messages clearly sent from colony to colony. They decided to make their own treaties with Native Americans for if it came to war. They wanted to make sure they would have some allies. They began to make their own governing bodies and their own legislatures within their colonies that were separate from Britain to start to make their own decisions. So more and more we're seeing that the colonies are starting to prepare themselves from their separation from Britain, even though they're still claiming, and even though there still is this glimmer of hope that for some reason King George is going to all of a sudden realize what's going on and they're still going to be able to be considered English citizens. But they're not blind to what's happening, and so they are preparing themselves for what will become an eventual separation. Meanwhile, back in the colonies, we move into our next major battle of the Revolution. Lexington and Concord sparked that initial conflict between the two groups. Now the Battle of Bunker Hill becomes our first real official battle of the war. The Massachusetts militia was set up on Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, right, along Boston. You had an army of about 2,400 redcoats that fought off about 1,600 Americans that makes up what was known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. Right, the person in charge for the Americans, for the militia, was Colonel William Prescott, and he is most well known because they were low on ammunition. So his orders were, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. So they wanted to conserve their ammunition until the British were close enough that they knew that their hit would definitely be one that was valid, that they wouldn't waste any shots. The Americans were eventually forced to retreat, but only after causing more than about 1,000 British casualties. And so even though Bunker Hill was a loss for the colonists early on, it was important because the British saw that the militia and the colonists themselves were not just going to be pushovers, and they weren't going to be that easily taken over. So even though, yes, they had to retreat, but they did cause quite a bit of damage before doing so. Now, despite the fact that the Battle of Bunker Hill happened, the colonists still kind of hoped that they would be able to come to terms with Britain. And so the Second Continental Congress actually sent King George one last appeal, one last way of trying to bring about peace, and that's known as the Olive Branch Petition. This is one last attempt to bring peace with King George III. They urged King George to negotiate, to recognize that the colonies should pretty much rule themselves on most issues. They still regarded themselves as British citizens, but being the colonies here in the Americas, they still had the rights to pretty much self-government in most things. King George, though, refused to read the petition, and instead he decided to hire about 30,000 German Hessian, and Hessian is just the German word for like mercenaries. They were paid troops to fight alongside with the British. So with that, the colonists then pretty much saw themselves as having no other further choice than to eventually break away from Britain. One of the major strategic points early on in the Revolution was Fort Ticonderoga, which was a huge British fort that had a lot of weapons. And so the Patriots, who were led by Ethan Allen, who was part of the Vermont militia, and Benedict Arnold, who was part of the Connecticut militia, right? And Benedict Arnold is going to play an important role later on because he is most well known for being a traitor against the Americans to the British. They both attack the British fort and are able to take it over and seize its large supply of weapons, primarily its large supply of cannons. So back in Massachusetts, right, back in Boston, General Washington arrives with his newly formed Continental Army. And he then sends Colonel Henry Knox to be in charge of transporting the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga that they had just taken over to Boston. And he is able on foot in the middle of winter. So this is definitely quite a feat to try and accomplish. But eventually Knox is able to bring those cannons over, and Washington moves his army to Dorchester Heights in Massachusetts and positions the cannons on Nook's Hill. And Dorchester Heights becomes one of the early battles of the Revolution. The Redcoats, under the command of Sir William Howe, are then forced to retreat because of the cannons and because of the Battle of Dorchester Heights and all of the cannon fire. They have no choice but to retreat from Boston, and they flee north into Canada. So this was definitely a very important moment within the American Revolution early on, where we begin to see that these colonial forces are not going to be so easily subdued by the British forces here in the colonies.